I want you to think back to your first memory of a historic event. You can even comment down below with it. I'd be curious to hear. This is mine. It was near Halloween, 1995. I remember being at a restaurant and everyone was watching the sports bar TVs pretty close. But it wasn't for a big Maple Leafs or Blue Jays game, but an election. Kinda. I was 6, and at the time I remember asking my mom what was going on. She was nervous and told me one of the Canadian provinces, Quebec, was voting on whether or not it would stay in Canada. She worried about the country's future and the future of French Canadians that remain like us. It was a long story that got us to that night, going back to the beginning of European colonization of Canada. So, with the many requests to talk about Canada this year, I decided to do my patriotic duty and talk about the time it almost fell apart. Let's talk about the referendum of 1995. Let's start from scratch. What's today Canada has been home to many indigenous nations and tribes for millennia, from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Arctic. The first Europeans to settle what would become Canada were the Vikings, who landed in Newfoundland in the 11th century. After that, the French arrived several centuries later, building a large, though sparsely populated colony called Nouvelle-France, or New France. They held on to this territory until the 18th century, when France and England engaged in a massive war. In Canada and the UK, it's called the 7 Years' War, but Americans call it the French and Indian War. The French lost, and the peace agreement included a transfer of all French-American territory minus Haiti and the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon to the British. This new British territory, now called Quebec, was French-speaking and Catholic and ruled by Protestants who speak English. The two cultures did not get along. The problem increased even more when Loyalist refugees from the American Revolution settled in the land we call today the province of Ontario. Oh hey, there's me. This relationship between French and English in Canada was a rocky one, with the occasional uprisings and one attempt at a Quebec revolution. The French majority of what we call Quebec was dominated by an English-speaking ruling class. The French were often second-class citizens and more or less servile workers to a British upper crust. Quebec nationalism began in this period as a hyper-Catholic movement to overthrow their Protestant oppressors. They opposed conscription in the First World War and disliked the now independent-ish Canada's ties to Britain. Nationalism hit a new phase, though, in the early 1960s. A decade of increasing education and political awakening for Quebecois baby boomers led to a growing French-speaking nationalist change historians call the Quiet Revolution. A number of huge cultural developments occurred in this period. What's important for this video is this revolution sparked a strong anti-Canadian nationalist feeling. And sometimes it got extreme. At one point, a terrorist group called the Front de Libération du Québec kidnapped 2 politicians and killed one in October of 1970. Prime Minister Trudeau, no, not him, his dad, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, imposed martial law. I could go more into it, but I think that's the subject for a later video if you want it. The game changed when former reporter René Lévesque entered the picture. He helped found a new provincial political party called the Parti Québécois, with others looking to separate Quebec from the country. Their goal was independence, but with economic ties to Canada, such as a shared currency. They called this plan Sovereignty Association. In 1976, the PQ won a surprise victory with a promise for a Sovereignty Association referendum within their first term. During the first year, they passed legislation like to this day controversial Bill 101, which enforces the French language. They pop up in the news from time to time for enforcing this law in strange places, like telling an Italian restaurant they couldn't use the word pasta. It's still a sore spot in the province, and I don't want to make too many enemies today. Trudeau combated every step Lévesque took to urge Quebec towards independence. Again, not him, his dad. Trudeau was a Quebec politics veteran and pretty much blocked a referendum the entire time he held office. The opportunity came in 1979 when the Progressive Conservatives took over the federal government. Yes, Americans, even our conservatives are progressive. Or they used to be. This party doesn't exist anymore, but again, a story for another time. The new Prime Minister was the Albertan MP Joe Clark. He was a bit more into Ottawa playing a smaller role, and so he didn't interfere in Quebec. On June 21st of that same year, Lévesque announced Quebec would hold a 1980 referendum. The Parti Québécois published a fancy policy document outlining a new partnership between Canada and an independent Quebec. At the same time, some goofs in Ottawa caused a call for another federal election, with Trudeau taking back the reins as the leader of his Liberal Party. The person he put in charge of dealing with the referendum was Jean Chrétien. Write his name down, he's important later. Here's where the story gets very Canadian. The question put on the ballot of the Quebec referendum was, the government of Quebec has made public its proposal to negotiate a new agreement with the rest of Canada. Based on the equality of nations, this agreement would enable Quebec to acquire the exclusive power to make its laws, levy its taxes, and establish relations abroad. In other words, sovereignty. And at the same time, to maintain with Canada an economic association, including a common currency. Any change in political status resulting from these negotiations happen with popular approval through another referendum. On these terms, do you give the government of Quebec the mandate to negotiate the proposed agreement between Quebec and Canada? So yeah, that didn't pass. 60% of the Quebecois voted it down, and Lévesque promised they would be back next time, Gadget. Next time. The government followed the referendum with an attempt to, quote, repatriate the Canadian Constitution. Oh, didn't you know in 1980 the Canadian Constitution was still in the United Kingdom? Yeah, I know. This also meant a new round of constitutional talks. Quebec wanted a bunch of veto powers over new amendments that the rest of the provinces did not want just one province getting. This process was intense, and at one point it resulted in the premiers, or leaders of the provinces, making a deal with the federal government when Lévesque, representing Quebec, went home for the evening, an agreement Quebecois sometimes refer to as the Night of Long Knives. As a result of this deal, Canada repatriated the Constitution without any support from Quebec. At this point, Quebec was less sovereign than before the Parti Québécois election in 1976. In 1984, Canada decided to get on the 80s conservative train and elected the Progressive Conservatives, or PCs, back into power. Man, wouldn't it be weird to explain to Americans we had a progressive conservative party who were called PC? Anyways, the new Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's campaign promises included finding a way to work with Quebec's objections about the Constitution. Lévesque said he'd try to cut a deal which split the Parti Québécois, leading to his quitting politics in 1985. The PQ then lost power in Quebec to a provincial version of the Liberal Party that was against separation. Mulroney and the new Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa would make the deal instead. The premiers all tried to work out an agreement in 1987, but for various reasons, including snubbing Canada's Indigenous peoples, most considered these meetings massive failures. They tried to label Quebec as a distinct society within Canada, but had no firm description of what that meant. They sent it out as a referendum to Canadians, who voted it down in dramatic fashion in 1990 due to lack of knowledge about what this was about and more than a little anti-French prejudice. Quebec fumed over this whole debacle, and soon after, a member of Mulroney's cabinet named Lucien Bouchard, with a few other Quebec politicians, started a new separatist party at the federal level, with the goal of separating Quebec into its own country. They called the party the Bloc Québécois. The government tried to cut a deal again in 1992 with a new agreement called the Charlottetown Accord. It contained a lot of the stuff from the last meeting, as well as some new discussions about what Canadian federalism meant. It failed miserably too. The game would then change again in 1993. Brian Mulroney, sensing the PC party was in trouble, bravely resigned and handed the party over to Kim Campbell. She was our first and so far only female prime minister. I'm pulling for you, Nikki. And served all of 5 months. The Liberals were back after a huge upset in the 1993 election. Yeah, we got the two-party system too. The new prime minister was Jean Chrétien. Remember him? He was the guy in charge of the federal managing of the last referendum. 1993 could be considered a setback for the Progressive Conservatives. They went from a majority of seats to 2, not 2%, 2 seats. The Conservative collapse was so complete, the Bloc Québécois was actually the official opposition, or the government's second largest party. Here in Canada, we have something called question period, where the opposition gets to ask questions of the government. Lucien Bouchard used it to troll the shit out of Chrétien pretty much every day. Then, in 1994, Quebec had another election and the Parti Québécois got back into power under a new leader, Jacques Parizeau. So we have a separatist party as opposition in Ottawa and a separatist party in Quebec, and everyone's super pissed off. You can imagine where this went. The plans for Referendum 2 were underway. This referendum would be a bit different. Because of new free trade agreements like NAFTA that were all the rage in the 90s, the separatist leaders didn't see it necessary to have the Sovereignty Association plan like in the 80s. This was a full-on separation. Debates occurred between hardline separatist and softer ones, and they came out with a referendum question that has to be even more Canadian than the first. Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign after having made a formal offer to Canada for a new economic and political partnership within the scope of the bill respecting the future of Quebec and of the agreement signed on June 12, 1995. Quebec was set to go to the polls on October 30th. The campaign was a little bananas. The French president Jacques Chirac said he'd recognize Quebec if they voted for independence. Saskatchewan secretly discussed plans of declaring independence or asking the United States for annexation. Lucien Bouchard, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, caught, I shit you not, a flesh-eating bacteria and lost his leg. He then showed up to separatist rallies on crutches after he recovered. The Aboriginal people of Quebec got super mad that they weren't being consulted in this whole thing. Quebecois soldiers got pamphlets telling them to abandon their posts and report to Quebec City in the case of a yes vote. And it even came out Bill Clinton was having meetings over whether he considered what the American stance would be and whether to let Quebec into NAFTA and NATO. Now that you're all caught up, let's go back to that October night when I was 6 years old and in a sports bar with my mom. Okay, that sounds a little bit weird in retrospect. The vote was razor thin. 94% of Quebecois people came out to the polls, and by 50.58% to 49.42%, the referendum failed. English Quebecers and allophones, or people who speak neither English or French as their first language, voted 95% against it. The indigenous peoples of Quebec voted against it more than 90%. Parizeau, who hadn't prepared a concession speech, blamed money and the ethnic vote, and pretty much poisoned the movement as kind of racist. One guy was so upset about the loss that he broke into the Prime Minister's house with a knife, but Jean Chrétien's wife, Aline, stopped him. And I bet you thought Canadian politics was boring. It was a pretty close call for our country. Today, the separatist movement's at an all-time low, with millennials not seeming as into it as their boomer parents. The Bloc Québécois still exists, but it's tiny compared to the 90s. The Parti Québécois still exists, but aren't in power. They also seem more interested in telling Muslim women what they're allowed to wear rather than another referendum. The nationalist vote is splitting into left and right versions, but it's still a long ways off. But what if? I don't want to indulge in too much alternate history here, but it's a pretty big question political scientists have thought a lot about. They fall into two major camps. One argues Quebec and Canada would expedite the process of separation, making large compromises to make the separation as painless as possible. The other camp argues the opposite, that the negotiations would take so long, by the time they worked out a deal, all the desire to go through with it would have fizzled out. The referendum was a close call, and though I didn't appreciate that at the age of 6, it makes me pause today and look around. I'm very much a hybrid of French and English, and French-speaking people are around the entirety of Canada, not just Quebec. I think what makes the nationalist movement misguided in my eyes is a lack of appreciation that having both English and French parts is what makes Canada and Quebec Canadian and Quebecois. It reflects my patriotism that my first Canada video is about it almost falling apart. Happy sesquicentennial. Happy 150th birthday, Canada. If this is your first time here, be sure to push that subscribe button down below and hit that bell notification to make sure there's a little history in your life. If you want to get videos straight to your inbox, there's an email list you can sign up for with a link in the description. I would also like to hear what the first historical event you remember is in the comments. Step Back is brought to you by these wonderful human beings, as well as Don and Carrie Johnson. You're making history education online better for everyone. Merci d'avoir regardé, bienvenue bientôt pour plus de Step Back. À prochaine.